Yeah.
Good afternoon. This is Dawn Monaco from SPAN. We're going to hold for just a couple more minutes to allow more attendees to join. We had roughly 75 registrants, I should say, and we only have a few people on. So I'm going to give it a minute or two to allow more people to sign on, and then we'll begin. So if you could just hold for another minute, that would be great. Thank you. Okay, I think we're going to get started. People will continue to join us, but I wanted to get a few things out of the way right now. So again, my name is Dawn Monaco, and I am a co-director on the Reach for Transition grant here at SPAN. So we want to welcome you to our Reach for Transition Lunchtime Learning webinar series. We're going to be putting up a link during the webinar so that you can access some of our other webinar recordings. This is being recorded and it will also go up on that page. This is part 3 of a series. So if you're interested in the other 2 series, you can access them from that page as well. Also, we will have an evaluation to this webinar. Since we are grant funded, we have to evaluate all the work that we do. So we will give you the link to that, and we will also send it out through the Eventbrite site, so you'll receive it through an email from Eventbrite as well. And we do ask if you could please complete that evaluation, because it does help us moving forward to see what it is that the community and the attendees are looking for with our webinars. So I did want to mention that when we begin this webinar, we're not going to answer any of the questions until the end. So you can put them in the questions box, which is here to the right in the panel down. If you click on the arrow, you can add a question there. Feel free to do that while you're thinking of it, but we won't go ahead and address those questions till the end. Also, everyone on the webinar is muted. You've either joined your audio through your phone or through your computer, but you are muted so that there's no interference in during the webinar. So there are some other things here on the right-hand side in the dashboard. Down below, second to the bottom, there's a title there called Handouts. In that, you can download a copy of this PowerPoint. So the PowerPoint is in there as a PDF, so you can download it if you need to see that as well. So what I would like to do now is introduce to you our presenters. So this webinar is Disability and Sexuality. As I said, it's part 3. This part 3 is Abuse Prevention and Empowerment. And we were very lucky to have 2 presenters from a agency called Finding Your Individuality, and they can talk more about their agency as they move through the presentation. But today we have Tracy Higgins, and she's the co-founder and the director of counseling for Finding Your Individuality. And let me just mention that that's an agency here in New Jersey. And then we have Melissa Keys DeJoy, and she's also a co-founder, and she's the director of education at Finding Your Individuality. So I'm going to switch the screen over to them so that they can begin their presentation, but just bear with me as I do that. So I'm going to switch presenters, and I'm going to stop. There we go. I think that now, Melissa, you can do your screen. Okay, so there we go. Just bear with us for a second as she opens that up. And there we go. And Melissa, you just need to unmute yourself, and then
why is this? Good afternoon, everyone. This is Melissa Keys DeJoya. I'm the Director of Education and a certified sexuality educator through the American Association of Sex Educators, Counselors, and Therapists, also known as ASACT, at Finding Your Individuality. And we are a private practice located in Watchung, New Jersey. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague and co-founder, Tracy Higgins. Would you like to introduce yourself to the group?
Hi, everyone. This is Tracy Higgins, and I'm the Director of Counseling. And Melissa and I are really excited to be here today to talk about our programming, our services, but more importantly, to talk about abuse prevention and empowerment, how to help individuals find their best self, but also how to find safety in their relationships and happiness in their relationships. So abuse prevention, we talk a lot about the statistics, and we talk about what is abuse, and it's definitely a hard conversation to have. But Melissa and I, we really like to take a positive approach, and we really like to emphasize the healthy aspects of the work that we do. Again, the goal is to not just increase awareness around the vulnerability of abuse, but also to help people achieve happy relationships that they're satisfied in and that they feel good in, and that's a big part of the conversation today. So we're happy to share in that with all of you out there.
So we wanted to take a quick moment to just check in on our technology. Dawn, are the slides visible to the group?
I cannot see your presentation. I see that we're viewing your screen, but nothing is there. Oh, well, that's the main screen. Okay. I saw something. There we go. Perfect.
There we are.
Okay. So I'm going to mute myself unless you need me.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone, for your patience with technology. We know that it's always helpful to have people support us in using technology to provide this information. So,
and Melissa,
so
just want to hit main screen, I think, underneath show. Oh, there you go. It's better. Never mind. You're good.
Excellent. So as Tracy mentioned, we're a private practice and we're committed to providing quality education and counseling to individuals of all abilities. And our mission is to empower individuals with the education, skills, and support, as well as resources they need to meet their fullest potential in the relationship they hold with themselves and others within the community. And one way that I describe finding your individuality as a private practice is that we provide education and counseling to support people's social, emotional, and sexual health. And we have a special emphasis on abuse prevention and sexual rights with people with disabilities. We work with people across the lifespan to identify, address, support, and advocate, as well as advance the individual rights of people. And we are really big on community-based involvement. We try to work with community members within varied settings to provide education, training, and counseling services to people of all abilities. And our services are individual and group counseling. We provide workshops in the community. We do professional development. And we really want to thank you for your time being on our webinar today as we talk about this very important topic. If any of you are looking for additional classes, we're going to talk about the importance of people knowing what abuse is. It's very hard for people to know what abuse is and be aware that abuse is happening if they don't have education. So we provide education classes in the community, and if you'd like to learn more, the PowerPoint that you can access after the event today includes links to see more about the classes that we're providing for youth and adults.
This is Tracy Higgins. I didn't mention earlier that, as part, we've already talked a lot about the education piece, but I am a licensed professional counselor, and we do, as part of our program, also provide individual and group therapy counseling. So that is another big aspect of our programming, and Melissa and I, as she already discussed, we really feel that both education and clinical counseling is important for many people. So we're thankful that we're able to provide both of those components.
We also just want to kind of name quickly that we're going to be talking about a topic that can bring up lots of different feelings. So just know that we are here as a resource to you. If you have any questions or want to talk more about the conversation today, we would be happy to continue the conversation outside of our webinar today. So we're hoping that as part of the webinar today, as a result of being part of the webinar today, that you'll be able to state 2 risk factors that contribute to the prevalence of sexual abuse associated with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, explain 2 ways that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are impacted by a history of sexual trauma and other forms of abuse, define trauma-focused care in supporting people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and identify 3 benefits for taking an interdisciplinary approach in supporting people with intellectual and developmental disabilities with a history of abuse. So we wanted to start off by talking about why it's important to consider trauma history when working with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Tracy, would you like to talk more about this?
So we are going to go into statistics, but before we do that, I think it's really important to understand the common experiences that an individual may have as a person with intellectual differences, with developmental differences. Common experiences of growing up, and not for everybody, but for some, looking for a sense of belonging, feeling feeling the reality of bullying and discrimination and isolation, purely related to the disability itself. Looking at the definition of disability in how a person identifies, and the impact that in itself may have on how a person sees themselves in this world. So Melissa and I and I do a lot of work around the sexual trauma piece, survivors of sexual trauma, but the reality is that for many people, there are multiple experiences that they may have that can potentially impact them as a being in this world, as a person in this world. So Melissa and I talk quite a bit about how do we see ourselves, as an individual, hence finding your individuality. So how do we see ourselves and these experiences that we may have within our community, and some of these experiences being abusive, some of these experiences being negative, how does that impact us moving forward? So when we're looking at the statistics, people with intellectual differences, people with sensory differences, people with developmental disabilities or developmental differences, the reality is that, yeah, there are a common experience of name calling and manipulating and coercion and being pressured and feeling discriminated against. And this particular population is considered a vulnerable population, and there is oppression that happens among individuals with intellectual developmental disabilities. So today we're going to talk about the impact that has, and more importantly, how do we empower people? How do we help individuals move forward through some of these experiences and still maintain their self-worth and still move on to be productive and successful in their life? So before we can talk about sexual violence, we have to define it. So I think it is really important that that we recognize this particular definition of sexual violence comes from the New Jersey Coalition Against Sexual Assault. It's right on their website. And we at the sexual assault centers, I worked for a county sexual assault center in New Jersey. We define sexual violence in that particular environment as verbal harassment and inappropriate sexual language, unwanted sexual touching of private parts, unwanted display of sexual parts, pornography, exhibitionism, sexual assault, which can be by stranger or by somebody we know, tricking or manipulating a person into sexual activity, exposure to pornographic materials, forced abortion, sterilization, pregnancy, pursuing sexual activity when the victim is not fully conscious or is not asked or is afraid to say no, hurting the victim physically during sex or assaulting his or her genitals, including use of objects or weapons intravaginally, orally, or anally. Now, all of these different aspects of sexual violence, what is really important, the most important piece here is the consent piece, is that any type of sexual activity has to have permission. So when we're looking at some of these particular behaviors, we're looking at some of these particular acts and these situations, consent is always at the forefront. Looking at in a relationship with another person, what do we give permission for? What do we consent to? And if there is something that is sexual in nature that is happening that is making a person uncomfortable, making it's an act that wasn't something that permission was granted, then we define that as sexual violence. So often I also get the question of, well, what's the difference between sexual assault versus abuse? So sexual abuse is a pattern of unwanted and inappropriate sexual behavior that is ongoing, whereas sexual assault is a single event. So we do have individuals who have a history of sexual assault, it may be a single event, but then also may have a history of sexual abuse that may be more chronic. You know, again, with the words unwanted and inappropriate highlighted in these definitions. So the prevalence of abuse, these statistics are always hard to hear. I do think that it's important so that, you know, the reality of that vulnerability, that people are aware of that, so that we can move forward in risk reduction, so we can move forward in being able to provide education that can help reduce a person's risk. We can't eliminate the risk entirely. Anybody in this world, whether you have a intellectual difference or not, is at some risk for sexual trauma, sexual violence, or abuse. Anybody could fall victim. And I think that's really important for everybody out there to understand, is that often we think that abuse happens in only certain, in specific situations or with specific people, but any person in this world could potentially become vulnerable to abuse or become victim to abuse. You know, so all people, whether you have a disability or not, can consider taking steps to reduce their risk and learning more ways of how to do that. You know, so what is the prevalence? Children with disabilities are 2 to 3 times more likely to be bullied than non-disabled peers, people without disabilities, according to the National Bullying Prevention Center, stopbullying.gov. Individuals with disabilities are 4 to 10 times more likely to be abused than their peers without disabilities. 90% of women with intellectual developmental disabilities will experience some form of sexual abuse during their lifetime. 92 to 98% of victims reportedly knew the abuser. 44% of survivors of sexual abuse with IDD had a relationship with the perpetrator specifically related to their disabilities. And only 1 to 3% of all incidents of sexual abuse are perpetrated by strangers. I know that some of you are probably noticing the dates on the statistics and research, and unfortunately, the research is scarce. You know, so we do tend to go back to these individuals who have done a lot of the research in the area of IDD and sexual abuse. Hopefully, there'll be more people, especially now with the Me Too movement and everything that is happening, you know, within our communities, the attention and awareness that's been raised. Hopefully now we will be producing more research in the area of IDD and sexual abuse. More research in the area of sexual abuse alone, period.
So I just wanted to kind of quickly comment that one of the earlier slides, we were talking about why it's critical to be thinking about trauma when supporting an individual with an intellectual or developmental difference. And what these statistics remind me of is how common, unfortunately, how common this experience is for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Often the perpetrator is someone that the survivor knows. And that's a really important thing, I think, for all parents, caregivers, anyone supporting somebody with an intellectual or developmental disability knows and understands, is that oftentimes, you know, abuse is perpetrated by somebody the victim knows. So the more that individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities know about abuse, the more that they are familiar with what abuse constitutes, the more empowered they are to both recognize it and to get support in and around it. We're hoping that no one has these experiences, but we want to make sure that survivors have access to supports.
Absolutely.
So Tracy had mentioned previously that anyone of any background could be vulnerable, but what makes people with intellectual and developmental disabilities particularly vulnerable? That's one of the reasons why we're here today, is to talk about that vulnerability. So people with intellectual and developmental disabilities often have the experience of viewing everyone as a friend. And that may be because of experiences growing up, socialization growing up, that there isn't distinctions around boundaries and relationships. So sometimes a person might have that belief that everyone is their friend. Oftentimes people with intellectual and developmental disabilities have limited social opportunities, and as a result are socially isolated. There may be experiences with low self-esteem and strong need for acceptance, and therefore a higher tolerance to abuse. Some may also have the experience of lacking assertiveness, and we really want to try to encourage parents and caregivers to foster that sense of assertiveness, however that might be. There's a lot of different ways that people are assertive. People with intellectual and developmental disabilities are also vulnerable because they often frequently fail to disclose because of a fear of not being believed or taken seriously, or the individual, the perpetrator, is somebody that the victim knows. And so therefore there might be a very real fear of being isolated or not having access to support. So we really want to make sure that survivors hear that they're not to blame, that we're non-judgmental, and that we're here to provide support. And people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are often not taught to reduce the risk of abuse, and that starts with naming it. And that's why Tracy started with talking about what sexual violence is. What does abuse mean? Because we're not able to recognize it if we don't know what it is, if we don't have a name for it.
So we focus at FYI quite a bit on education and the importance of education. And a part of education, the benefit of educating on abuse is giving language to abuse, giving a name to it. You know, if we don't have a name for abuse, then it's really hard to report it. You know, so when we're looking at the vulnerabilities, lack of understanding of what constitutes abuse is one of the vulnerabilities. Not knowing that what is happening to them is within their right to say no or to stop. When we look at many individuals with differing abilities, they may have a lot of support. They may have a dependency on a lot of people around them. You know, so when to assert yourself, when is something that an authority figure may be doing, you know, when do we have the right to say, no, I don't like that? Or when do we have the right to say that that's abusive? You know, if we don't understand our rights in this world, then it's really hard for us to exercise them. You know, so lack of understanding of what constitutes abuse is definitely a vulnerability. The compliance being overly reinforced at home and within our systems. I worked as a behavior analyst for a number of years, and you know, within our behavior support plans, non-compliance was a targeted behavior. You know, so the idea of, you know, years later when I started to work in the area of sexual abuse, in the field of sexual abuse, you know, this idea of being non-compliant and helping individuals be more assertive and to be non-compliant, it had not been within my training early on, and it hadn't been emphasized in the programs that I had been working with. It actually had been the exact opposite was emphasized, you know, being compliant. So, you know, there is a balance, is that, you know, we do want to be able to support people in following their schedules, and we want to be able to support people in learning new skills, and we want to be able to help individuals meet their maximum potential. But part of that is also learning when to be non-compliant, and that's part of the abuse prevention piece, is knowing that refusal and non-compliance piece, actually teaching it. Some individuals may live in strictly controlled environments where tools to communicate are hidden or restricted. You know, so we do have some individuals that are vulnerable just solely because there's such a high dependency on, you know, on others who are abusive within their environment. You know, so it's essential for those individuals that come into our program, when we start to see signs of abuse, we may see changes in behavior, or we may see actual physical bruising. When we're noticing that something doesn't seem right, when that individual discloses something that's happening, it's essential to be able to act, because that may be the only means of communication for that person. And especially for a person that, if that person's living with the abuser, then then that person has that abuser has a lot of control and power over that individual. And that restriction piece, that hidden piece, that, making it impossible to communicate to others, that being controlled, definitely makes it hard for that person to get help. So it is essential that we do act right away when we see something that may be a sign of abuse. So some more research around individuals with intellectual developmental disabilities. This is a study that showed people with IDD often have difficulty employing effective refusal and self-protection strategies. So that further reinforces the vulnerability that we were talking about earlier. Individuals with intellectual disabilities, deficits in communication, and behavior disorders presented as having a higher risk. So that for those of you who are working with individuals who may have a dual diagnosis, individuals that may, and when I say dual diagnosis, I mean somebody that may have, in addition to their intellectual developmental disability, may also have a, a diagnosed mental health disorder, or may have a history of behavior maladaptive behavior challenges that have been supported by behavior plan. These are individuals that are at higher risk and may be more vulnerable, may be more of a target for perpetrators. So it is something to remember. Part of that vulnerability also comes from the reliability. So the thought is that because of the intellectual disability, because of the deficits in communication, because of the behavior disorders, the story won't be considered reliable. And we know that that's not accurate, and that just because a person may need assistance in communicating what is happening does not mean that what is happening is not happening. So again, these are the statistics, and we are talking about vulnerability right now, and this is a more vulnerable population.
So the one thing I'd like to encourage, especially parents, to consider is practicing or incorporating in opportunities for decision making, opportunities for communicating refusal or disinterest. We want to make sure that young people and adults, and this starts, I think, is young people, that young people have opportunities to practice communicating what they want and what they don't want. It's very hard to recognize things that you're interested in or disinterested in unless you've had that opportunity to practice that decision making. So I'd like to encourage the parents to practice that refusal skill at home. It could be anything. It could be practicing refusing to go with a particular shirt color, or refusing a sugar packet. It could be anything, but trying to practice these moments of refusal or disinterest, or communicating no. And that no can be communicated in a variety of ways.
So what is the impact of abuse on an individual? What is the short-term impact? What is the long-term impact? The impact of abuse can be multifaceted. So there's to try to break this down in a more simple way, when we're looking at what impact abuse has on an individual, there's three pieces, and often all three are impacted: how we feel, how we think, and how we do. So as professionals that are out there and that are working with individuals with differing abilities, I think it's really important to, when we're doing our assessments, to consider these three pieces. For caregivers as well, looking at these three pieces in consideration of treatment planning, and in consideration of goal setting. How again can these situations of abuse impact what we feel, what we do, and what we think. So some of these ways that feelings are impacted are feelings of blame, shame, and embarrassment. We have a lot of clients that come forward and they don't want to talk about it. They feel very shameful that the abuse has happened, particularly around sexual abuse. It's embarrassing. It's hard enough for children, adolescents, and adults to talk about their bodies. It's not something that we are talking about every day. It's something Melissa and I talk about every day, because that's what we do here, we're very comfortable talking about it. Melissa, especially as a sexuality educator, she just goes on and on all day long and totally loves every minute of it. But that's not everybody's reality. The reality is that, yeah, we don't talk about our bodies, and often when we do talk about our bodies, there's negative messaging that sometimes happens. So people who've had their bodies hurt, people who've endured sexual trauma, shame, blame, and embarrassment come along with that for many. The loss of trust, looking back at the statistics and the acquaintance piece, the reality that often the abuser is known by the person. It's not a stranger. And I just went not too long ago to a conference, and the conference was on perpetrating sexual abuse. And the reality also, research had very much shown that, for many people, the perpetrators are met in the community. Even though we are vulnerable online, a lot of times it's a community member that goes online. So they've already met this person, and then they find ways to infiltrate into their lives. So for those parents that are out there and for those professionals who are supporting individuals that are online, this is a new social opportunity. And there are definitely pros and cons to being online and meeting people. One of the cons is that there are people that are targeting other individuals. There are perpetrators that are online specifically looking for victims. But there is, again, the emphasis on often it's not the stranger that people are falling victim to. Often it is somebody that they have already met and they know. So that trust piece is so important. I know we got a little sidetracked there, but the trust piece, when we're looking at feelings, it's really important to understand that yeah, the abuse itself, the physical abuse, is hard to recover from, and it's painful, but so is the betrayal of this trusting relationship, or what you thought was a trusting relationship. So that's one way a person may feel coming out of an abusive situation. Fear of safety, anger towards what has happened, anxiety and depression are all common feelings. So how does this impact our thinking? I put a couple, Melissa and I put a couple examples, but this is not the only way it can impact thinking. I'm alone, I'm stupid, I have no control, I can't change things. Going back to what we spoke about earlier with the common experiences for people with differing abilities, those common experiences of in their lifetime possibly being made fun of or being isolated because of their differing abilities. I think it's really important to kind of throw that in there as well, and consider how that impacts how we think about ourselves, and how it impacts or may impact how we think about ourselves in relationships with other people. So the sexual assault, the sexual trauma, the abuse itself can impact our our way of feeling and thinking. The experience living with a disability can also impact our thinking depending on our environments and what we've experienced. The individual that is empowered and the individual that in their life, their whole being is emphasized. Strengths, areas that they may need help with or support. That individual that has that support and nurturing and has that empowerment, that ability to empower, how does that person think and feel compared to the individual that has been isolated, or that has been discriminated against, or has been who has been victimized and has suffered abuse in their life. And then there's the doing. As a behaviorist, I have to say the doing part, there's so much focus on the doing. What is this person doing? How can they do it differently? We can't think about the doing without looking at the feeling and thinking. They're all interconnected. So when we're looking at the doing and how our doing is impacted by abuse, a person may be avoidant of situations that reminds them of the abuse, or that they feel anxiety in, or they feel intense emotion in. Person may be confused. Their personal boundaries may be confused. They may have trouble saying no, maybe over or non-compliant. difficulty trusting, and demonstrating poor emotional regulation. So difficulty in being able to control their emotions. When a person has difficulty in controlling their emotions, and again, this is, whether you have differing abilities or not, actually, I think we all have differing abilities, correct? Whether we have intellectual developmental disabilities or not, our poor emotional regulation, for some, it's regardless of whether we have the disability. There are individuals without disabilities that may have poor emotional regulation, have difficulty in controlling or managing their emotion, and sometimes that's where the avoidance comes in. So if that person's scared of how they're going to react in a situation, they may avoid the situation, and that's the doing. Melissa, did you want to say anything about feeling, thinking, and doing?
I would say, as a sexuality educator, one of the things that I think would be really important for parents and caregivers to be thinking about is whether our young people have a sense of what feelings look like or how feelings are experienced. Some of the young people that we work with may have challenges with recognizing their home emotion or recognizing the emotions of others. So one of the things that parents and caregivers can do throughout a young person's life is to do education in and around feelings and naming feelings and talking about how feelings might be experienced. What happens with our body when we have feelings. And that's one of the things that we talk about here at FYI, is helping people recognize feelings of others, but also help people recognize the feelings that they might be feeling as well. And we'll be talking about some strategies for that at the end of the webinar. But for parents and caregivers, you can do this social emotional education at all times. Start naming feelings, talk about feelings, and explain how those feelings are experienced.
So since we're talking about sexual trauma, I'm going to give a quick overview of what post-traumatic stress disorder is. So for many people, post-traumatic stress is, may include triggers, which, a trigger is something that can be seen, felt, heard, or smelled. A trigger is something that often will induce memories of the abuse itself, of the trauma itself. So when we're looking at helping a person, that identification of triggers is really important. So what's triggering a thought? What's triggering a feeling? What's triggering a behavior? Mm-hmm. What the person is experiencing is real, and that's really important to understand, is that you can't argue with a survivor of sexual trauma that what they're experiencing isn't real. They are feeling it, they're seeing it, they're hearing it, they're smelling it. The way that they're remembering it is a whole body experience. And that's really, I have a lot of individuals that come into our practice with post-traumatic stress disorder, and it's definitely an aspect of this disorder that we educate on, is this understanding that when a person is saying it's real, mm-hmm. That's because of that multisensory, that's because of that all body experience that they're having. Memories are not just, it's not just our brain that remembers, our body remembers too. And post-traumatic stress very much that's an aspect of it. With post-traumatic stress disorder, there's a re-experiencing of it, an avoidance, and a hyper-arousal. So these are three key pieces when we're looking at diagnosing post-traumatic stress disorder. This is a general overview. I mean, for those of you who may be, working in a clinical capacity, my suggestion is always go to the DSM-5 and look at the actual criteria. There's very specific criteria when you're looking at diagnosing post-traumatic stress disorder. For this audience and for our, for the purpose of this topic, the abuse prevention, my main goal in giving you the post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis is more so to be able to emphasize aspects of it, the trigger piece of it, mm-hmm. Again, which can it's an aspect of the abuse, but it also is something to consider when we're looking at how to respond. Mm-hmm. How to respond to certain behaviors or feelings, or thoughts, if that person's communicating that to you. And then lastly, how does sexual trauma and PTSD impact behavior and learning? Again, going back to the feeling, the thoughts, and the behavior when we're looking at abuse and sexual trauma.
So I think it's really important for anyone that's doing any type of education around sexuality or sexual health, we need to be thinking about how having a history of sexual trauma and PTSD can make learning can impact how our young people and adults learn. It might make learning information challenging at times. We may need to be considerate of when and how we deliver information. And so I think it's really important to kind of make sure that you have a sense of what a person's needs are, their learning needs are, and then make sure that whatever strategy you're using is catered towards the learner to support their understanding of the concepts. And that includes assessing for trauma.
So I want to point out that I think Melissa and I do a lot of work around sexuality and having education curriculum being more trauma focused. And the reason for that is because of these statistics, that vulnerability is that we know that individuals will, that many people will have a history of sexual trauma or at least face some form of sexual abuse in their life, directly, again, related to their differing abilities, related to the vulnerability that that is there for them. You know, so saying that, I also want to emphasize that going back to the conversation we were having around everyday conversation, around talking about our bodies. When we're looking at sexuality, when we're looking at helping a person as a whole, you know, if that person had right from the start, early on, proper sexuality education, sexual health education, if that person had positive messaging around their body, then, you know, at the time of the assault, these topics would be a lot easier to talk about. It wouldn't be considered such a taboo. And the language would already be there. You know, so talking about your body, talking about sexuality, talking about sex, talking about sexual health, talking about all of these you know, these topics that encompass a person's sexuality. Again, it would make it a lot easier to be able to disclose, report, and discuss sexual trauma, something that may have happened that wasn't healthy, that was abusive. You know, so when we're looking at the big picture, it's really important to understand that, yes, Melissa and I do a lot of work around curriculum needs to be trauma focused. We need to be prepared to support people that may be triggered by our curriculum. But understanding that if that education started earlier, if that education was done and messaging was more positive, that triggering wouldn't be so intense. And that's what we're looking at, is that when we're looking at a person and we're trying to understand a person, we're trying to understand their behavior and how they see themselves or how they see themselves in a relationship with other people, that can be very complex. You know, so it's not as easy as just developing a behavior plan and then responding to that one behavior. We really need to be able to do proper assessment. And you know, that sexual trauma piece, that knowing there's a high prevalence, I think that needs to be part of that assessment. You know, so for example, the slide that's before you, you know, we demonstrate these various behaviors and how we could spend a year with, you know, refusing to shower. We can spend a year on a behavior plan. If we don't properly assess why that person's refusing to shower, if we don't recognize that refusal may be related to sensory processing, or it may be related to a sexual assault incident. If we don't recognize that, we can spend years with improper treatment planning, years with consultation by, you know, a professional that does good work, but maybe doesn't do work in that area. You know, so I do think that when we're looking at assessment of behavior, that Melissa and I very much follow an interdisciplinary approach, is being able to kind of look at the big picture and always putting the abuse trauma piece on the forefront. You know, we just want it on the map. We want it to be considered. And I know that again, with the past year that we've had in the Me Too movement, that we are seeing more of an awareness. And that's really, really, I can't emphasize enough how important that is. And especially when we're looking at a person's behavior and we're working with a population that is very vulnerable. So these are some examples of different behaviors that may be assessed in different ways. I don't know, Melissa, if you wanted to kind of talk about some of these, behaviors that are here and response to it, maybe some experiences you've had, with varying behaviors.
I would say that one of the most important things to consider about any behavior is to understand the nature of it in order to provide supports that are going to address the need of the function of the behavior. So for example, I look at a behavior on here that reads masturbates in public, and my mind is reeling to a lot of different things. Like, is there a physiological component to the self-genital touch? Is the person in need of a sensory, diet awareness or assessment? Is it just that the person needs to better recognize where and when self-genital touch might be expected?
Or what if the person has a social anxiety and they're self-soothing?
Right.
And that's what works for them.
Right.
So it's one way that they found in their life that it works. It helps them with their emotional regulation.
Mm-hmm.
But this also shows that, when you have somebody that's engaging in a behavior, that it may work for them in one environment, but then if it's their only tool, if it's their only source
for self-soothing,
then how detrimental that can be if they're using that in a setting that where it would be inappropriate.
So the point that we really want to kind of key in on with this slide is to recognize that there are a lot of different reasons for behavior, like the ones that are listed on the left, like refusing to shower. And one of those reasons, an underlying factor to that, might be having a history of trauma. But without a proper functional behavioral assessment around the behavior, then we may be introducing resources that may not be catered to the need. And taking an interdisciplinary approach is often most beneficial in addressing those needs. And that's what we've been talking about. So one of the things that we do here at FYI is we center the individual. Any treatment plan that's put together is based on the needs of the individual, and that means centering the person, getting to know their history, and understanding their mosaic of identities, their backgrounds, their experiences, and then determining a treatment plan of many different, interdisciplinary supports that's going to support the person best. And that might include, going for physical exams, or it might include getting education around sexuality or sexual health. It could include a lot of different things, but the most important person in that interdisciplinary approach is the client, is the individual. We know that underreporting happens in general, but especially with individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And here are some examples of underreporting statistics: that 1 in 30 instances of sexual abuse against individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities are reported successfully. 1 in 30, that's too few. And among the general population, in this statistic is 1 in 5. We cannot stress enough the importance of people knowing what abuse is and being able to detect it. Only 3% of sexual abuse cases involving people with developmental disabilities are ever reported. Again, that statistic is too low. We want the reporting numbers to come up. So why does this happen? A client may be coerced into or threatened into not saying anything via threats to hurt them or their loved ones. The individual may feel shame or believe it is their fault when it is not. The client may fear that they're going to get in trouble if they report it, especially if there's somebody that's supporting them. Often remember that a perpetrator is somebody the victim knows. So the client may be very afraid that they're going to get in trouble or that they're going to lose supports. They may not understand what happened or what is happening is abuse. There may be some limited ability to communicate and therefore report abuse. And there may be a lot of dependency on the support or what is familiar. So we want to make sure that we recognize these reasons for underreporting and we do our best to reduce those barriers. So that's where we are now, that with knowledge comes power. It's hard to report abuse if we don't have a name for it. We need to talk about abuse more. And that means not only talking about what abuse is, but also talking about healthy boundaries too. So when we're supporting people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, there's a lot of different considerations, learning differences, backgrounds, experiences, and that includes differences in language. So if I'm going to be doing an education session with a person or a group of people, I need to recognize the language differences. How does that person interpret social cues? Oftentimes, people with intellectual or developmental disabilities may have challenges with social cues. So, doing education around social cues is really important. And often they have difficulty with misinterpreting types of relationships. So education around types of relationships and what's common in relationships is really important. So when we're providing information, and for parents and caregivers on this call, this includes you. You are your young person's primary sexuality educator. I'm a sexuality educator by profession. You are a sexuality education educator by your experience of being a parent. So you want to find out what that person knows already before introducing new information. Find out what they know and then capitalize on that to provide more in-depth information. Provide information in a way the person learns best and use these techniques when teaching a topic. These strategies, by the way, come from a really great book by Terry Cohenhoven called Teaching Children with Down Syndrome About Their Bodies, Boundaries, and Sexuality. This book is really fantastic, not only for parents, but also for professionals. You want to use pictures and other multisensory techniques to teach concepts and use language that's accessible to the person. This may be simple and unsophisticated language. Check for understanding before building on new information. You want to make sure that you're repeating, reviewing, and reinforcing information. Remember that the information that you're providing may need to be provided ongoingly over time, and of course you want to make sure that the information is age and developmentally appropriate. Another great source for information for young people, this is not a book for young people, but David L. Hartman has written 2 different books for young people. But for those of us that are parents and professionals, this book is great for kind of thinking through how to provide information. It's called Sexuality and Relationship Education for Children and Adolescents with Autism Spectrum Disorders, a professional's guide to understanding, preventing issues, supporting sexuality, and responding to inappropriate behaviors. Not only does Davida talk about what young people need to know and when they need to know it, but provide some guidance on how to provide that information. Tracy mentioned many times today about the importance of discussing sexual anatomy. We want to talk about body parts in all of its context. Let's talk about eyes and what they do. Let's talk about noses and what they do. Let's talk about genitals and what they do. Let's talk about all of the functions. And let's be normal and matter-of-fact about it. Let's use medical terms. Let's talk about these functions simply and briefly. And we want to, as part of these conversations, introduce and reiterate abuse prevention messages. Your body is your own. You make decisions about who is near you and who is far away from you. Who are the people that might be involved in supporting you and your body? And who are the people that should never be touching you? And how do we bring those conversations up? Who do we talk to? How do we disclose instances when boundaries have been violated? One strategy, curriculum that's out there is the Circles curriculum that was written by Leslie Walker Hirsch and Mark Lynn Champagne. And this curriculum helps people understand the differences between relationships, behaviors, and boundary setting. So the concept of this is that we have different levels of touch, talk, or trust based on the type of relationship we have with the person. So again, if we're able to recognize what behaviors and what contact is common for the types of relationships we have with people, we might be more equipped to recognize when somebody's initiating contact or suggesting contact that's not appropriate or not expected. Another program that's out there is Social Signals, and this is by Nancy Noel, and this program helps young people, particularly on the spectrum, understand the difference between boundaries. And in this video series, there's a main character named Mike, and Mike demonstrates healthy boundaries in one set of videos and then unhealthy boundaries in another set of videos. So what's really helpful about this video series, and this is for professionals, but also they have a family set now too. This would be a great way for you to introduce the differences between healthy boundaries and unhealthy boundaries with your young people. Escape Now is a curriculum that was designed and implemented and newly revised for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And this curriculum helps individuals understand what abuse is, talks about different types of abuse, and raises people awareness around what abuse is, helps people recognize decision-making strategies around staying safe now and staying safe later. That's Unit 2, And then there's a clinical component where people can have ongoing clinical support, 6 sessions, about 30 to 45 minutes. We'll be actually delivering Escape now in our office here in Watchung, so feel free to reach out to us if you'd like to learn more about that program. It's a 12-week or a 12-session series. So who can we go for support? So naming abuse and finding support is really important, and we need to know who are the people we can communicate about this. Who is our safe person? That might be a parent, a guardian, a case manager, a counselor. And when we have abuse disclosed, we want to make sure we support that person.
And this is really important for when we're looking at being able to provide education and help reduce risk, being able to just identify a safe person. So, whoever you're working with, if you're a parent, understand that, or a caregiver, understand that it's really important that we have this conversation around, well, who would you go to? Who is considered your safe person? Mm-hmm. And to have what Nora Baladarian has a handbook on sexual trauma and individuals with intellectual developmental disabilities. And in that handbook, she talks quite a bit about an action plan, mm-hmm. Having an action plan and having it laid out, your safety plan. So Melissa and I are big advocates of that idea.
And I cannot underscore the importance of parents and professionals being that safe person, being that primary sexuality educator, and supporting that young person ongoingly as they change and grow.
So when we're looking at when somebody discloses and when you're doing education, understand that it does increase the potential for disclosures, and we shouldn't be afraid of that. That's how we access that's how we connect somebody with help and treatment. So if you suspect sexual abuse or a person reports sexual abuse, every county has a sexual assault center, both for 13 and under, and then 13 and up. So you have a county-funded program. There are grant-funded programs that provide supports to survivors of sexual abuse, sexual trauma, and to their caregivers. Support the victim, because most likely that individual is fearful that you won't believe them and or won't be accepting of them. Be non-judgmental and use non-judgmental language. Feelings and memories of abuse make it hard to talk about it for most survivors. So avoid pressuring the person to talk. Don't interview the victim. Leave interviewing to specially trained professionals. And sometimes that's hard when we're in environments where that person may be like a school environment, for example, where they may be in contact with a lot of different people. Understand that in these cases, everything that's documented, let's say there's 10 people that this person interviewed with or met with, and they have documentation, for somebody who may be communication impaired, that report may look differently depending on who they're talking to. So that doesn't help them. And that's why it's so important that, we have specially trained people that work with individuals with intellectual developmental disabilities. Connect them as soon as you possibly can. Those are the individuals that are trained in holding these interviews. Do not involve more people than necessary. Document and report the details disclosed, provide resources, and make appropriate referrals. Familiarize yourself to your organizations and your organization's reporting policies and procedures, and to the local resources that are in your county. Melissa talked a little bit earlier about some of our work as a agency. These are some of our upcoming parent and caregiver groups that we're going to be running in the next few months.
We really encourage everyone on the call to register and come on out to these events. Our first event for this year is Becoming Askable and Approachable, all around creating a space for young people to want to talk with us about sexuality. For parents and caregivers, you are that primary sexuality educator. What are some ways that we can create space for young people to want to have conversations? What can you do to foster communication? And we'll be doing another event on puberty and self-care in November, friendship and dating in December, and boundaries in technology in January. And our goal with these groups is to support parents in feeling comfortable and empowered to communicate with their young people to foster healthy sexuality with youth.
And this is our contact information, and we thank you for spending this hour with us. We hope you enjoyed your lunch, and we hope you enjoyed the workshop that we put in place today for you. And we hope to at some point connect in the future.
So Melissa and Tracy, my gosh, thank you so much for this. That's so much great information and resources for the families that we work with and for professionals and for youth and young adults. So thank you so much for spending an hour with us today presenting this for us. I do want to mention that I think there was a question, and anyone else, if you have a question, please, let me just enlarge this. Okay, so we have a question. An area of concern for me is that when a person exhibits one of these behaviors, is that abuse is not brought up. Instead, these are seen as non-compliant and are subjected to punitive measures. Often the paperwork that follow a person from agency to agency shows them as behavior problems and non-compliant. How do we ensure that agencies are held accountable? Let me open this up, I'm sorry. How do we ensure that agencies are held accountable or that the person is given proper treatment outlets so that they can process what has happened? I know this may be an unanswerable question. I'm looking to address this issue. How can people on the front line identify what is trauma related versus non-compliance?
Okay, so this is what we're talking about. So this is an excellent question, and that person who's out there, I hear your frustration. We get a lot of these calls, and we get a lot of question around supports. What's the proper support? And my recommendation again is that this is what we were talking about earlier with interdisciplinary approach, is that you need somebody that works with individuals that may be demonstrating problem sexual behavior or who has an understanding of behavior. So you also need somebody that has an understanding of sexual trauma. So I do think that this is again what we were talking about earlier around proper assessment, is that if the behavior is improperly assessed, and we have in New Jersey the New Jersey ARC Criminal Justice Advocacy Program. That's another program that would be beneficial to consult with, is when you feel that certain behaviors are being punished or criminalized, or if that person's getting in trouble because of those behavior, whether it's legally or terminated from a program or whatever it may be. There are programs that work with individuals whose behaviors have been criminalized or maybe have been misassessed or misdiagnosed. So this is what Melissa and I often will go and talk about, is that it needs to be properly evaluated, assessed. You need to connect with the right people, and sometimes reporting and sometimes decision making and action does need to be questioned. So for those of you out there who are experiencing that, you always have the right to question somebody's decision making on a person's behavior and whether or not it was properly assessed. So it is a complex question, and I hope that these resources help. I know that it probably didn't answer every bit of this question. It is also a question that I think requires probably more one-on-one consultation. But I hope that this general information is helpful. And for those of you who feel that maybe something has been misassessed, I do encourage that you continue to reach out for resources and that you continue to gather information and connect with the right professionals.
I just want to piggyback real quick, Tracy. The other thing that was playing in my mind too is the importance that an agency takes in abuse prevention and abuse disclosure cannot be underscored. Like, if you do not have a policy for abuse, that's something that I think all agencies need to have. If you are wanting for individuals to have support around a history of abuse, then you're going to need to have a policy in and around it. So if that's something that you are wanting to do, we can, we'd be happy to talk with you more about that. But I think it's got to be prioritized as part of the work that you're doing.
Right, and as part of the agency as well, is that, under IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, all individuals have the right to proper behavior support planning. They have the right to a proper functional behavior assessment. And if you feel that within that agency, or if you feel within that environment that there isn't an expertise to evaluate those specific behaviors, then you have the right to go outside of that agency. You have the right to a proper functional behavior assessment and a behavior support plan that ultimately is going to encourage appropriate alternative behavior. Again, when these behaviors are related to the disability, and when these behaviors are related to something that may be abuse related, that person has the right to proper assessment and treatment.
Correct. And Tracy,
So I hope.
Oop, I'm sorry, Melissa. I just wanted to piggyback on what
I know.
Tracy said. So if a couple of things that you mentioned during the presentation that really stood out to me. One of them was practicing making choices, what the young person or the child or the adult, what they want, what they like, what they don't like. These are really important skills that for them to be taught at an early age. And again, talking about your IEP and IDEA and the New Jersey Administrative Code, if your young adult or student is not able to do that, then that should be a goal in the IEP. And I put up in the chat box our website and our phone number, because if you're a parent and you don't know how to go about making that happen, please give us a call. We have a technical assistance hotline where someone can help you write a letter to your school and talk you through how to make sure that those goals and objectives are included in the IEP, because it's again really important. And as Tracy and Melissa said, it's starting off with choices. What clothes do you want to wear? Give them 2 choices and have them pick one. Make their voice be heard. And then as an adult, they'll have that skill to say no to someone if something should happen to them. So I think that this information is so important. Yes. Yes.
Dawn, I just want to piggyback on what you're saying about the IEP, because in New Jersey, there's core curriculum content standards for sexuality education, what they call family life education in New Jersey. And what we have found in our experience working with adolescents and adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities is that their formal experiences learning about these concepts is completely inconsistent. So as part of your team meeting around supporting your young person, I would encourage you to start asking questions about when and how the sexual health content is being delivered with your young person.
Absolutely.
And if it's not being delivered, then that needs to be a priority as well.
Absolutely. I agree 100% with you, Melissa. That should definitely, I've experienced with families that I've worked with, when all of the other students are learning health education, too many times our students with intellectual and developmental disabilities are just plopped in a health class and they don't understand anything that's being taught, and it's not individualized to their needs. So it's really important. So I don't see any more questions. I did see that someone said that they're going to email Melissa and Tracy directly. That's wonderful. Their contact information is here. I want to once again mention to you that we did put the evaluation up in the chat box so that you can go ahead and fill that out after we finish this webinar, and it will also be emailed to you through Eventbrite. Stay tuned, because we're going to continue this topic to part 4 on acceptance and individuality. So that will be sometime in the winter sometime. So please stay tuned for that. I think that I mentioned everything. Melissa and Tracy, once again, thank you so much. This is great information. Please reach out to them if you should need any more information and take advantage of their classes. I know I personally will be as well. And everyone is just saying that this was excellent. Thank you so much. So thank you, Tracy and Melissa, and I look forward to working with you again very soon.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting us.
Have a nice afternoon, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.